Resident Evil 5 is an interesting game. It often gets comparisons to Resident Evil 6 for both being more action-oriented than the games preceding and following them, but Resident Evil 5 is a game with an identity crisis. I'm okay with that because I enjoy the particular identity crisis on offer. I played Resident Evil 6 entirely in co-op, and I'm in the middle of playing Resident Evil 5 entirely in co-op. The feel of playing both of these games is significantly different, and what marks the most massive differences are two major elements: resource management and character movement. Before I get into that though, the reason these two are so different from RE6 to RE5 is probably because RE6 resolved the weird identity crisis RE5 experienced by going all the way instead of stepping back. Some people hated it, I loved it, and I'm glad that Resident Evil didn't just stay that way and got back on track, because RE6 is special as a one-off experience. It wouldn't have felt special and it would have overstayed its welcome if more of the franchise just continued that way. So what exactly changed to make these two games feel so different from each other, and what caused the biggest of those differences? Interestingly, it was their closest similarity that caused them: cooperative play, and Capcom's response to the effect that it had on the experience. See, the co-op gameplay is the reason Resident Evil 5 is a strange experience between worlds, and Resident Evil 6 is firmly settled into being what it is without questions, doubts, or concerns. Resident Evil 5 is still trying to be survival horror, which is on some level commendable, but it's also a little short-sighted. RE5 doesn't work to be frightening most of the time because the horror atmosphere of Resident Evil is endemic to its sense of isolation. In Resident Evil 5, you're not isolated because the game is built to be played with an ally. Chris's partner Sheva is always by his side, whether she's being controlled by a human player as intended or by her AI, which is suboptimal but still kind of playable. What this should have meant is Resident Evil 5, getting the message and seeing the big picture and switching over to allowing increased fluidity to the player character's movements, since going co-op necessarily means forsaking survival horror anyway, but what it did mean instead is that it's neither a legendary horror game nor a legendary action game. What it is stuck in a limbo between the two. A somewhat fun co-op experience with item management that's unique to this game, and quickly became its defining trait for me personally. When you and your partner get into the swing of things, it's pretty satisfying to swap items back and forth, reload your guns, throw ammo between each one's inventory, heal each other, give each other different weapons depending on the situation and what makes sense, and all kinds of other interesting things like those. Perhaps the most interesting thing this causes is a sense of reliance on each other, which Resident Evil 6 forgoes in exchange for a little more autonomy. In RE5, swapping items with the other player doesn't work if you're too far away from each other, so if you want to have your full action pool available, you want to stick close together as much as you can. This acts as an effective method of tethering the two of you without actually inhibiting your overall positioning options in an overly artificial manner. Resident Evil 5 will never tell you you are too far away from your co-op partner, but it will gray out your give item action, and that kind of entices you into making decisions about whether you want to spread out now so you can cover multiple angles, or come together later so you can access your combined inventories. The limited item space also incentivizes staying together, because if your inventories were massive and could carry everything you could possibly want, there wouldn't really be a need to trade, and therefore less of a need to stay together. RE5 forces Chris and Sheva to each accommodate all of their weapons, ammo, usables, and healing within 9 measly slots. Because 9 slots times 2 is 18, that means staying beside your partner effectively doubles your available carrying capacity as long as the two of you coordinate well. This kind of ability to trade back and forth, look at each other's inventory, and see who has how much ammo and health at all times lends playing together a certain kind of tactical atmosphere, especially the better you get at quickly parsing and using all that information. It gets you into the headspace of being a BSA operative, who are a much more militant and organized task force. You're not playing as a terrified civilian in an impossible and nightmarish situation. You're an armed operative deployed into a combat zone full of BOWs that may be unsettling, but that you're ultimately equipped to handle. The mechanics of this game reflect that headspace, particularly in the way your two-person squad handles their resources. The inventory management isn't just lightly reminiscent of classic Resident Evil, it also invokes the Capcom vibe of getting more skilled the longer you play. At first the inventory is clumsy and weird, but soon you figure out that you can rearrange items by pressing square and dropping what you picked up into another slot. Shortly after that, you realize that you can combine ammo with guns or herbs with other herbs via the exact same mechanism, without using the drop-down menus. Just pick up the box of bullets with the same square button and drop it onto the weapon in need of ammunition, and it'll be instantly reloaded without any animation. Suddenly, the act of organizing your 9 slots becomes even more interesting, because placing bullets next to their respective weapon and combining herbs so you can clear up space become valuable options. When the ammo supply for a gun is in an adjacent slot to that gun, that means it's only 3 button presses away from being reloaded instantly as opposed to, say, 6. This all becomes a handy bit of tech for savvy players, because why would you ever want to reload a shotgun by waiting for Chris or Sheva to plug in every round one by one, when you could just reload it by dropping an icon on another icon in a flat 2D menu in a fraction of the time and save oodles of seconds. It's pretty amazing. This kind of speed and lightning-fast item management has applications both during tense fights and outside of them. When you've finished an encounter and you're doing housekeeping in your inventory to make sure you're all refreshed for the upcoming sections, you can start combining herbs and reloading all your weapons while wasting minimal time. This is important in this game because if you're with another human player, minimizing downtime is something that improves the enjoyment of the experience for both of you. Even more crucially, achieving those instant reloads and quick item management strategies inside of, quiet moments during those boss fights where you've made space and made distance for yourself gives you a sense of safety that you earned by having the foresight to put stuff in the correct slots ahead of time. All of these inventory management shortcuts become even more valuable in RE5, specifically because of how limited your character's movements are, since the unshackling of mobility that occurred as of Resident Evil 6 has not yet been taken on board here. And what that means is all of the item management has significantly greater consequences, because you can't just dodge out of the way of bad decisions. You can't just slide out of the way of poor item management and poor foresight. How Chris and Sheva move in this game is similar to how Leon moves in its predecessor, Resident Evil 4. Your movement speed feels quite slow, even though compared against enemies it's pretty quick. You can sprint, but you can't strafe while sprinting, and you're unable to attack while moving in any way. You're constantly choosing between what position to move to, then readying a firearm or your knife, which puts you at a complete standstill, attacking, dropping your aim, and only then being permitted to move again. It's a flow of choosing various anchor points to pin yourself to, deploy attacks from, then move away from that point as enemies swarm ever closer to it. I understand why this was done in Resident Evil 4, the game that pioneered this new kind of character control for Resident Evil. We'd feel too in control if we could move and shoot at once, and this decision was likely the result of a thought process designed to make the game frightening, despite the player being armed with the fluid and smooth controls newly introduced. The GameCube certainly had the capability to let you move and shoot at the same time, but Resident Evil 4 chose not to make use of this in order to maintain a feeling of unease. It's also likely some reverence to the classic RE games, which also prevented you from moving and shooting at the same time. I really respect this kind of legacy feature in games, so I find this charming. This feeling of slow movement speed enhances dread. Enemy attacks and windups are also quite slow, resulting in a sense that you could be hit at any time, since you're always moving a little slower than your brain would prefer. However, because enemy animations are as drawn out as they are, you get to dodge most attacks as long as you begin moving away from or past the enemy in time, while also staying inside that pocket of threat for longer. By slowing down both the enemies and the player, Capcom extends this window of fear. The moment in which you wince and clench up, shrink into yourself because you don't want to be hit by a gross, unfeeling assailant. The use of these slower animations on the part of enemies and the player to widen that dread of almost being hit, though attacks are not so threatening and are easy to dodge, is clever. A fun question I had for myself was the following. What does this decoupling of movement and attacking do to each of these states, and to the player's thought process? What happens to your decisions if you must always choose between putting damage on the screen or moving your character? It makes the timing of each much more important. The interesting thing about Resident Evil 4 and 5 is that movement informs when you can attack, and attacking informs when you can move. By moving correctly, you're allowed to attack for longer before being forced to flee again, and by attacking correctly, you cause enemies to become temporarily inactive, which lets you freely move around for longer before you're forced to attack again. It's a yin and yang. A major combat element in these games is that hitting a limb or head often applies a long stagger to enemies that lets you run past them, focus on other enemies, or hit the stunned one with a situational melee. This melee in turn deals damage, doesn't cost any resource, and forcibly shifts the enemy's stance into a grounded state. When enemies are grounded, they can't interact with you, and they have to spend a long time completely finishing their stand-up animation before they can attack or grab you again. By attacking enemies with considered precision, you can strike them with melee to put them on the ground, which effectively disables that specific opponent for a long time. What's especially cool about this in the tactical department is that with proper positioning, you can stack up a few zombies behind each other and put them all in the ground with a single melee. This is one of the strongest actions you can perform because it has a disproportionate impact on the battlefield around you, and it conserves every resource you have, including the most important one: time. By multi-grounding several enemies, the effect of a single stun and the bullets that caused it becomes amplified. This kind of crowd control is central to the combat loop of Resident Evil 4, 5, and to some extent 6. See, because you can't move and attack at the same time, and because you have ranged weapons whereas most enemies attack with grabs and punches, preventing them from moving is very important, because it acts as a kind of equalizing force between you. Applying stun to foes with your bullets so you can run through gaps in the swarm while they recover complements the constant choice you have to make between your two sources of power, attacking or moving. Resident Evil 4 and 5, therefore, feel more often like a fast-paced game of chess against enemies that happen to be grotesque monsters than they actually feel like action horror games. There's a lot of micro decisions and thinking involved. Sometimes you want to knock down guys so you can get an ammo pickup on the other side of an enemy, or sometimes you want to do the same so you can escape from an even more dangerous foe behind you. The more I play Resident Evil 5, the more of these interesting situations I end up appreciating. This all coalesces into a sharpened point when we bring in the cooperative element, which is where both movement and resources culminate in an experience wholly unique to Resident Evil 5 that not even RE6 quite replicates. Managing inventory in Resident Evil 6 isn't just more streamlined than Resident Evil 5, with no need to rearrange anything, rarely asking the player to discard items, granting us an increased amount of space, and the only item mixing on offer being herbs of various kinds. Resident Evil 6 also features a complete lack of interaction between the inventories of both players. It's a purely individualistic experience, except that you happen to be with another player who helps you deal more damage. It is a cooperative game, but this cooperation only extends to damage, healing, and puzzles, and stops dead in its tracks when it's time to manage and coordinate resources. For all intents and purposes, Resident Evil 6 has the inventory of an action game because it embraces being an action game. It might be one of the mechanically richest third-person shooters, standing with legends like Vanquish, but the tension of staying alive because you're running out of supplies, the stress of managing both players' sense of need in a fair and reasonable way, just isn't a concern here. Resident Evil 5, on the other hand, has the inventory of a survival horror game, while also being conscious about itself being played cooperatively. Both of these elements try to meet each other halfway. Unlike most Resident Evil games, RE5 doesn't pause when you open your inventory. All the management you're going to be doing has to be done in real time, as whatever spooky foe tries to chomp on your flesh draws closer. That means you need to get good at doing this fast. Your brain and your hands need to be trained to identify and act on your resources efficiently. It's fortunate then that each player's inventory is condensed to 9 slots, and you don't need to rotate or move items around Diablo style like you had to in RE4. The reason you'd rearrange items in RE5 isn't so you can make them fit. unless you're combining them to make them go away, but so that you can combine or reload in the fewest button presses possible. Put your ammo next to the gun that uses it so you can reload with the speed of a total ninja. All items take up a single cell, because RE5 understands the importance of facilitating this fast-paced item management in a game where time doesn't just stop for you, and your partner is counting on you to finish up quick. Unlike Resident Evil 6, in which items are instanced, and both players get their own copy of them, items and resources in RE5 exist as truly singular objects that both players have to distribute between themselves at their own discretion. If I pick up this box of bullets, you don't get to, and if you're the one who picks up that herb, then I can't. At first glance, this seems irritating. You might wonder why this game is pitting you against each other like this when you're supposed to work together, but play just a little bit longer, and it starts to become apparent how this creates an atmosphere of mutual reliance on each other, hammering in how important communication and teamwork is. To open your inventory, you should put some distance between yourself and enemies, so you attack with precision, you maybe knock them down, and then you start your menuing. In order to pass items back and forth, you have to be standing close enough to your ally, which means the space that both of you occupy has to be reasonably safe, as well as the space you need to move through in order to get to that space. That means stuns and staggers that are done with deliberate purpose. The ally who's being given the item doesn't need to do anything, which means they're the one who can be in charge of firing on hostiles and keeping them suppressed, basically protecting both of you, all while you're the one who's handling the items, opening your item grid and picking out what you want to give. That the game keeps moving and waits for no one as you sort your resources should make it even clearer why it's so important to get skilled at rifling through your inventory. The ultimate goal is to never have to use the drop-down menu at all, and instead just grab and drop items onto other items. Learning not to reload your slower loading guns using an animation is so strong because every second is precious. If how you attack defines how you can move, and how you move defines how you can attack, then how you use your inventory defines both of those things. How you do all three of the above while coordinating with your partner, now that's the true test, and that's where the really badass situations and the really cool teamwork come into play. One shoots a zombie in the leg, the other melees them into their shambling brethren. One mixes herbs for both of you to make use of when you need it most, while the other covers them. Many times one of you will be low on some resource and you'll teach each other how to reload your weapons quickly, then pass ammo back and forth for a quick top-up in the middle of a fight. When you and your ally achieve this kind of rapid coordination, you start to feel absolutely badass, like a two-person Spec Ops team that's been fighting together for years. In other words, you start to feel like the BSAA agents that Chris and Sheva are supposed to be in the Resident Evil universe. It puts you into their headspace and makes you feel like you need each other, while also showing you that if you work as a team, there's nothing you can't overcome. All of this is what makes Resident Evil 5 so unique, so special, even among its own franchise. To do such a great job of transplanting Chris and Sheva's mental state onto players, this game uses its cooperative gameplay, its movement mechanics, and its inventory system to get people thinking through problems and solving them the same way these characters would. Resident Evil 4 already had deliberate anchor and shoot movement, as well as the need to manage scarce resources, but it's in the clashing together of both of these elements that Resident Evil 5 becomes what it is. Before RE5, movement and resource management lived in separate worlds, at the most staring longingly at each other from their balconies. But by making sure that while managing items you're playing the same game you play when moving and shooting, instead of warping you to a different screen while time is frozen, Resident Evil 5 unites these systems and is enhanced for it. If RE5's real-time inventory wasn't present, the game wouldn't be what it is. It would just be a bargain bin shooter that's somewhere between a great action game and a great horror game, without anything to supplement that limbo between worlds and bridge it into something unique. Instead, even though Resident Evil 5 may very well be what I've just described, it's also something else. A very enjoyable, well-considered co-op experience that lets you get more skilled at every facet of its design. It is a Capcom game, after all, and it's a game that breeds camaraderie, friendship, and teamwork. A game that everyone should experience with someone they care about at least once if they ever get the chance. This has been Leo K on Resident Evil 5. Thanks for watching.